All right, so let's start talking about the multicellular primary producers in this lecture. Last one we were talking about single-celled microbial organisms. We talked about the viruses, the bacteria, and then the algae and the protozoans, or the protists, the single-celled critters that are producers, but then also the primary consumers that are going to be single-celled organisms as well. So in this lecture, this chapter, with chapter 6, what we want to look at is the producer base of the marine ecosystem that is made up of multicellular organisms. You know, big things that have lots and lots of cells compared to just the single-celled critters that we talked about. So what we're really talking about, seaweed. And then we'll talk about some plants, but honestly, the marine ecosystem, there's not a lot of plants to worry about. We'll only have a handful of plants to discuss because most plants, they don't do real well in salt water. That's a huge issue for them. Okay, so what we want to do is let's start with how do we classify seaweed? You know, what criteria, categories, features, etc. do we use to organize seaweed into different levels of classification, different groups? The first feature is let's look at the structure of the seaweed. You know, what's the shape? What are the general features present in that seaweed? The second key feature or characteristic here is what type of photosynthetic pigments are present in that seaweed. You know, how do they photosynthesize? Chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, chlorophyll C, fucoxanthin, xanthophylls, etc., etc. That's usually what gives them their color. So we use kind of the color of the seaweed, but colors derived from the photosynthetic pigments to help organize and classify these guys. All right, now they're all producers, so they're running photosynthesis. How are they storing their energy? When they make energy, how are they going to store it? What type of storage molecules are they using? And then we'll also look at the reproductive structures and the mechanisms that they use for reproduction. You know, what's their method of reproduction? What structures do they use for it? All right, so these are the four key concepts or four key things we want to focus on. Let me do a little Make sure you know these things. Okay, four key things we're going to use to classify seaweed. All right, so we start with that, and then we start looking at, all right, what kind of seaweeds are out there? Because we're going to see a lot of different varieties. The other terminology you're going to hear from different people with seaweeds is called the marine algae. Same stuff. Common terminology sometimes gets mixed around and interchanged. So seaweeds or marine algae, they are important primary producers. They're the base of the ecosystem in certain marine environments. So we definitely want to make sure we're comfortable with these guys. They are not plants. I will stress this over and over and over again. These are not plants. They have a lot of the similar features of plants, but they are not going to be a plant. All right, seaweeds are not plants because they don't have leaves, they don't have a stem, and they don't have roots. Those are all features of plants. Now they both groups run photosynthesis. Yeah, but they're still not plants. But what we do is we look at a seaweed and structurally we try to make it comparable to a plant. So when we look at the body of a seaweed, we're going to call this the thallus. Okay, so that's the general body of the seaweed. When we look at the blades are going to be leaf-like structures. They're not leaves, but they're leaf-like structures. So the thallus would be comparable to the trunk of a tree, the general structure of the tree. The blades would be the seaweed version of leaves. Leaves on a tree, blades on seaweeds or algae. The stipes, oh, too much there. Stipes Stipes are going to be the stem-like structures found in the seaweeds. They're not true stems. They're not branches. They're stem-like, branch-like. And then the holdfast is a root-like structure, or structures, found in the seaweeds. Now, they're used for anchoring and attachment. They're not drawing in nutrients. They're not drawing in water, because, well, seaweeds live in water, so they don't draw water in through their root system. So this is why they're not the same as a plant. We don't call these guys plants. They are algae. So they go in a completely different classification scheme. Traditionally, it was kingdom Protista. Now it's being reorganized. But they go in different phylum than the plants because of all these differences. Okay, so we're going to walk through the types of seaweeds present. We're going to see a lot of these things as we explore marine environments. And the easiest way to organize them is based on color. All right, so start with green. Green seaweeds. Call them green algae. They're green because they have chlorophyll A and B to run photosynthesis. A lot of them will also have the pigments we call carotenoids. These are the same pigment groups as we will find in true plants. Now, a key thing about the green algae, when they produce energy, they store it as starch. Right? That's going to be a big thing. Their energy, excess energy, is stored in the form of starch. And when we look at the cell walls of the seaweeds, they are going to be made up of cellulose. Okay? This is also similar to what we see in plants. So you got cellulose in the cell walls, starch as your stored form of energy. A lot of the green algae can actually infuse calcium carbonate into their structures, and we call them calcareous green algae. Calcareous just means calcium carbonate embedded into their tissue. So it makes them kind of crunchy and scratchy and not real easy to eat. So the advantage if you're a calcareous algae is you don't have a lot of predators because you're kind of gritty and crunchy and just not real tasty. So the picture down there is of a calcareous green algae called Helmidia. We'll see another one that's common in shallow areas and turtle grass beds called merman's shaving brush. So the old-fashioned shaving bristle brush that guys used to use 100+ years ago, it looks just like that. So those are green algae. They're a special type called calcareous because of the calcium embedded into their tissues. Right? So those are the green algae. We will see green algae when we look at the vast majority of marine ecosystems, especially when we get into shallower environments where sunlight can penetrate easier through the water. Some of the green algae we will see and explore are brown. So we go, okay, brown algae. So now you're brown because you have a different pigment. You got chlorophyll A, chlorophyll C, but then you have this third pigment that makes you special. This is the dominant pigment in the brown algae, and it's called fucoxanthin. All right, so fucoxanthin is what makes brown algae a brown algae. So it gives it its different color than the greens and then the reds and all the other algae that we're exploring and talking about. Now, what's interesting with the green or with the browns here, sizes range from tiny microscopic all the way up to these algae we call macroalgae. Some of the brown algae form kelp forests in the Pacific Northwest, and some of those things might be 200, 300 feet in length. I mean, they get massive, but they're not plants. They're still algae. Common one that we'll find in Caribbean environments is sargassum. That's the image on the right over here. Now, sargassum will have these little floats embedded into the body or the thallus of it and throughout the different blades. they're tiny little life jackets. It helps it float. So sargassum doesn't root and anchor down in substrate anywhere, so it doesn't have the holdfasts that we see in a lot of the others. Instead, it just constantly drifts around and floats around. We'll see it washed up on the beaches in the mornings and constantly drifting around in the different areas of the Caribbean. It provides home for a lot of different marine animals. There's a big area in the Eastern Pacific known as the Sargasso Sea, and this is where large amounts of sargassum accumulate, and sea turtles swim out there when they're babies to hide in there, to feed, to grow, and to get bigger. All right, so that's a brown algae. We want to make sure we're comfortable with how can we identify a brown algae. Well, it's going to be brown or tan or that yellowish color, and the reason they're different is that fucoxanthin pigment. Then the third group of algae to mention are the reds. So you go, oh, okay, it's a red algae. So you got green, brown, red. Red algae are red because they have chlorophyll A, but they also have this extra pigment called phycobilins. Make sure I spell this right for us. Okay, so phycobilins, and then there's other red photosynthetic pigments as well, but phycobilins is the primary one that gives it this red color. This group actually has the greatest diversity of all marine algae out there. There's tons and tons of different types of red algae. A big one we want to focus on is this stuff called coralline algae. Now it's similar to the calcareous green. It's got calcium carbonate embedded into its tissue, but it's a red algae with calcium carbonate. Coralline algae is tough and gritty and just, it's like cement. And when this grows on reefs, it actually will grow across reef structures, and some marine biologists look at this as the glue that holds together the marine ecosystem, that holds together a coral reef. So we'll get into this more when we start talking about coral reefs and reef structure, but this red algae, and it can grow from one section of a coral to another section to another and actually just lock it together like you're using concrete to hold together a wall. It's an amazingly tough, gritty, durable type of algae. So an important one, again, when we talk about reef structure. And then we'll see other types of red algae across the entire marine ecosystem as well. So not just limited to on the reef structure itself. All right, so we got three groups of algae: green, brown, red. Each group is unique because of those specialized pigments for photosynthesis. Reproduction. All algae or seaweeds are going to reproduce. When we look at reproduction, it can be achieved in one of two ways: asexual and sexual. Now with sexual reproduction, fragmentation is very common. A piece of algae gets broken off, washes away, grows and develops into a new algae. You just reproduced. Genetic identical offspring. So anytime a predator is eating algae and shreds of algae go drifting away, it's reproducing. Wave action comes in and knocks the corals around and breaks it apart, and the algae gets busted apart. Reproduction. So environmental disturbance can actually be good for algae. A certain level can be good for algae because it can help it reproduce and possibly colonize new locations. They can also produce spores in a form of asexual reproduction. So the algae form spores, produce spores. The spores drift away from the parent plant, settle down into a new area, and grow and develop. But those are identical, genetically identical to the parent plant. The other option is sexual reproduction. This is where you get eggs and sperm produced. Fertilization happens. You now have a zygote developing. That zygote drifts, settles down somewhere, and then eventually develops into a new algae. So in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at the economic value of algae and why it's important to us.